So yeah, my talk is going to be about unit testing Django applications without touching the database. And I am going to do a little demo of my library that I've written for this use case. But I also want to just generally present this problem and why I felt it was something that was important to kind of attempt to solve. So obviously this is important because Django is one of the most popular web frameworks for Python. And I'm sure most or all developers or any good developer would agree that writing unit tests for your code is very important. So this picture is supposed to represent unit testing, since unit testing is testing of the smallest possible logical unit of your code. And then of course, there's also integration testing, which is more about testing how these parts of your application work together, or just your application as a whole. And obviously it's important for your test suite to have both. So in this talk, I'm really going to try to answer these three questions. Why should I write unit tests for Django without touching the database? And why do I think this so often sucks in practice? And what can we do about it? So in this last part, I'm gonna do a little demo of my library, which is called Django-mockingbird, as you saw in the beginning. And yeah. So why should I write unit tests for Django without touching the database? Well, that's actually a question that I asked myself for the first time last year. I was working on a project and I was asked to do that. And so in the beginning, I didn't really understand why and how this was expected of me. And that made me anxious, so I did pretty thorough research on this topic. So what I started to notice was something almost kind of a divide in the Django community. Now, I think the majority of people still believe that Django unit tests should look like this. After all, this is a screenshot from the Django docs. So as you can see here, and usually that's in the setup method, we create the objects in the database that our test will need to pass. But what I started to notice was kind of a smaller but a growing part of the community that believes that as soon as we do this, as soon as we touch the database in any way, as soon as we create the objects, even if we then, don't persist them, or we then throw the database away or whatever, as soon as we touch it, these are already integration tests. So to me, that was kind of, that was an interesting, almost philosophical question to me. And that can get frustrating because what we're really doing is we're arguing over definitions of words, right? Unit tests, integration tests. But there is a practical aspect to this, definitely. And the first thing about it is obviously speed. Now, here you can see that we're subclassing Django's test case. And that means that Django creates a test database for us So even if we don't decide to keep it, it still does present, an overhead. And later in my example, you're going to see that when we're not touching the database in our unit tests, we can subclass simple test case, which does not create the database. So you can imagine that for a larger code base, this makes an important difference. Now, the other thing is that, we could argue, and obviously there's arguments on both sides. I'm not 100% for, one or the other, but the people who believe that these are integration tests, not unit tests, and we should write unit tests without a database in addition to those, I think that I started to see that they do make some great points. And, one of them is also the fact that we can then really say that our tests are independent, right? As you will see later in the example. If we don't touch the database, then they really, so to speak, can live on their own, and consequently that also makes them more robust. So yeah, like I said, I started to see more and more benefit to doing it this way. But why do I believe that doing so in practice often sucks? Well, the reason for this is because to not touch the database in Django unit tests in practice, what you have to do is you have to use a technique called mocking to mock your Django models and their methods and the queries, and basically the entire Django object relational mapper. So the object relational mapper is probably one of the main reasons that Django is so popular, right? But when you decide to write unit tests without touching the database and you have to mock the entire object relational mapper, the entirety of its behavior, I guess, it does become quite difficult and convoluted. And yeah, it does kind of suck. Now, I'm sure that most people, if you're familiar with unit testing in Python, you're familiar with mocking as well. But if not, the most classic use case for mocking would be when you're testing a function that talks to an external API. And you want to test just your function, not the external API, which you have no control over. So what you do in your unit test is you mock the response of your external API to have it, for example, always return a 200, so that you can actually test your code. So this is, in this case, obviously we can see that this is awesome, and it's just an important tool in your testing toolbox, right? And in Python, this is part of the standard library in unittest.mock. And yeah, there's just lots and lots of use cases where this is really important for your unit tests. But my point is that once you're starting to use this technique to mock Django models, model methods, queries, and everything else that you need to mock in order to not touch the database, this does start to suck. And you can start to notice that mock was not made with Django in mind, and vice versa. And they just don't play well together, I think. So what can I do about it? yeah, basically I started to notice that, and I thought it was a little bit of a gap in the ecosystem, that it started to become exciting for me to think about writing a library to attempt to solve this problem. So let's see a little demo. So we're gonna see a really simple Django app that I just made for this presentation. So let's say this is a blog app. And we only have the one model. It's a blog post model. And really, this is just an API that has one endpoint that returns all our blog posts. And we're using Django REST framework for this. I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with it. It's just a way for us to write APIs really easily with Django. And then obviously, we also just need the one URL. So this is all that we need to test here, the one endpoint. And I shouldn't forget to mention that the reason I used values here is because in Django, if you don't know, this dot values query returns dictionaries instead of model objects. And dictionaries are JSON serializable by default. So we don't have to use a serializer here. And I thought for simplicity's sake, that would be best. So that's all that we need to test. Just the one endpoint. So yeah, I'm going to show two tests which do the same thing. They just test the one endpoint. And the first one was written in the way that I previously claimed that it kind of sucks. And that's with the built-in mock from unit test. And the
Alan,
second,
can you zoom in a bit?
excuse me.
Zoom in a bit, yeah.
Yeah, where do I go? I think it's here. Is it here? Yeah.
Control plus is the shortcut.
Is this enough?
Yeah. Nice.
That's
Thanks.
pretty large, but yeah. Yeah, let's see if this test passes. Yeah. So the test does pass, obviously, but I borrowed this test from my coworker. Actually, I just changed the model. And so immediately when I was working on that project last year, I saw this test and I was like, okay, that's kind of strange. I wasn't immediately able to figure out what was going on here and why. And even now that I do have more experience with the mock object in Python, I still think that this is kind of not readable. Especially, you know, since we have so much code, and let's not forget we are testing one line of code here. So the first thing we need to point out here is the kind of weird way that we're using this patch object decorator. And again, for a different use case, that would be pretty straightforward. But here, since we have a chained query of the object relational mapper, we have to do this kind of weird construct that I mean, yeah, it's already weird, but once you imagine that this query was longer, because as you know, in Django, some queries can go to infinity, right? You can, I mean, you can technically chain stuff after values, but imagine if we had like filter, 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 filter instead of values here. And so how would we do that? You know, that would be convoluted, to say the least. So then the second thing that I noticed the first time I saw this test was the fact that we have to manually construct the data that we need this endpoint to return. And, you know, I just thought that this does seem like something that's ripe for automation. At that point, I wasn't sure if it was even possible to write a library like that, but I definitely thought that it was worth giving a shot, because what you have here is basically, you have similar use cases, right? Like if you're testing a Django app in this way, if you decide to do it this way, so without touching the database and using mock and stuff, you're gonna have a bunch of tests that are kind of similar because all of these queries are kind of similar because you have a finite number of, you know, the query set methods. So for each of these use cases, which are ostensibly similar, you're gonna have to do the logic from scratch. And I just thought that was something that we could at least try to automate. And my goal was especially to design an API that's as simple as possible so that it's, to put it simply, not this. So let's pip install. Let's pip install. Yeah. So this is the second test, which does the same thing with using Django-mockingbird. So yeah, we import it like this, and purposely I decided to not go into any implementation details in this talk because this could really go on for hours. And I did kind of, in the README itself, I did go into some details on what was the process behind my design. So you can read that if you're interested. But I really wanted to just do the basics for this talk. So all you need to know in order to just try it out is that I designed this so that it's a function, it's not a class. So basically, this is the main thing of the entire library. And it's really just a function that you pass your Django model object to, and it returns a mock of that object, which has everything that the object has, but without doing anything under the hood, without touching the database, without executing any queries. But it does, like on the surface, have all the behavior. It has all the fields, all the methods, and it does have the, you know, behavior that the object relational mapper has, where you can chain the queries and just everything that you need for the test to pass. So really, this is the only thing that you do need to know to write tests with this library. I mean, actually, there's one other thing, but monkey patching is something that I'm sure if you're familiar with unit testing, in Python, then you're probably familiar with monkey patching. And monkey patching is a technique where you replace a part of your code's functionality at runtime. So this is not really recommended anywhere outside of testing, obviously. But for testing, again, it's a very useful tool in your testing toolbox. And here I'm doing this directly. So I'm just monkey patching the mock object that my library is returning to the actual object of, that I need to replace. Now, obviously, there's other ways to monkey patch. There's the patch decorator from the built-in unit test. And later I'm going to show a little PyTest example. There's a PyTest monkey patch as well. So some of you might find this easier, but either way, all you need to do is construct this path correctly, which is kind of a little tricky at first. But then you figure out that you really just need to get the absolute path. And yeah, that's it. So yeah, these two tests basically, they do the same thing, yet this one is, in my opinion, much more readable and it's obviously shorter. And another thing that I would like to note again is that if this endpoint were to get more complicated, so for example, we do want to change the query to something more complicated, like a chained filter, whatever, or we want to just get the query set from the query and then later do some computations with the query set or add some logic, because usually you're gonna have some logic in your endpoint. So if this happens, you don't need to change this test a lot, because this line of code basically kind of covers all the cases, whatever you want to do with the blog post object in here, this line of code will be enough. So you can have like a really, really long query and you won't have to add anything because it will all happen automatically. So yeah, I do want to be clear about that without having to show an actual complicated example. While, for this test, obviously, you might think right now, this isn't so bad, but for this test, as soon as we change this query in any way, God forbid we start chaining filters, you're going to have to rethink this all over again, and it's gonna become exponentially more complicated with the query. So yeah, that's it for the basic use case. Let's go to the, so I do encourage you to check out the README for details, because there's, here's the monkey patch example, a PyTest monkey patch example I mentioned earlier. I know PyTest is popular and for good reasons, so yeah. I'm sure some people would prefer to do this than what I did previously. And then there's, there's a couple more things, but I think what I just showed covers a lot of the use cases. You can specify fields, because I know that obviously some tests require the model fields to have certain values for it to pass. And the syntax for this is this. And obviously, unlike, the unit test magic mock, this will throw an error if you're trying to specify a field that doesn't exist. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not gonna go on for too long. I do just want to say that if you have had any of the problems that I've described today, or if you can relate to any of these sentiments, then I do encourage you to try it out. Can I stop sharing now, or?
Yeah. All right. That was cool. Let's have some questions. Nice one though. How do I do a clapping thing? I'm gonna do one of these here. Yeah.
I usually do it with my hands.
I can't move them.
Thanks, thanks, Peter.
You just have integrated sound.
I mean, I'm gonna stop. Can I stop sharing? We can paste the link in the chat if anyone wants to. It's probably better for you to check out this yourself.
Yeah, most people can Google search Mockingbird Django.
Okay, then yeah, I encourage you to do that.
I would post the link on the meetup page.
No, it's there, right?
Is there already?
It's in the description.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so if anybody wants to browse back the history in a couple of weeks or months.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, anytime you're doing something like that, it goes without saying that if anyone wants to contribute to the library, that would be super awesome.
So I have a question. The MakeMocks. So you were passing it the blog posts, and that's like a class, if I understand right. So I have to pass like a class thing into a function. Is that legal?
Yeah, I'm actually sure that, well, at least I tried to make the code, I don't know. I tried to make the code as readable as possible. I wanted to say that as soon as you open the code, you'll see what's going on. But yeah, I hope that's true.
So on that, so can you like give like a few words, high level, like how do you do this? How do you know like what what you need to mock? Like what are these fields? Like just like high level, I don't know.
You mean how do you use the library?
No, in the library. Like what do you do?
Yeah. I'm trying not to do that because if I start diving into the source code, we're gonna be here till tomorrow. But okay.
Okay.
We have 2 minutes.
Thank you. That's gonna be enough, I'm sure. No. So basically, what this library does, it's just a wrapper around the Django Meta API. So Django has this thing called the Meta API, which Django also internally uses, and it has some useful stuff. For example, when I'm passing this class to this function, what this function does under the hood is the Django Meta API, gets the important information from the blog post that is then used to construct the mock. It gets its fields and all that.
Cool. We have a question from Matyash. Is there a way to undo the mocking after end of a test, or is it automatic?
Yeah, that's how monkey patching works, like fundamentally. So yeah, I think monkey patching could be a whole talk in itself. And maybe I didn't know how to approach it in this talk because to a certain degree, I did have to mention it. And then I'm like, okay, people probably are familiar with the concept if they've done unit testing in Django, but then it's still a little complicated to, yeah, have like actual intuition about it. So yeah, monkey patching is actually, you're just replacing the object for the duration of the test, for the duration of whatever's happening. So you can, yeah, just for the moment. I don't know how to, if there's like a better computer science term for that. I mean, it's kind of it's kind of weird because not all languages have that. And it's also controversial because a lot of people are like, you know, the Python has it and then you can abuse it if it has it. Because using it outside of testing is kind of risky because it has unintended consequences. So yeah, it's a lot. This could be a whole other talk. But long story short, it's automatic. Yeah, just for the test.
Cool. All right, do we have any more questions? And if you don't want to speak, you can also put it in the chat. I have a question about in the example. So when you, in the first example, the long one where you had to like do all the data and more lines in the test itself. So in the data, there were like these fields of the stuff. When you mock it, like, do you have to invent values or it doesn't matter?
It did, in this example, it didn't matter because the test, the actual function that we were testing, the endpoint, it didn't really need any specific fields. So in this example, no, but I could think of examples where, you know, you're calling like blog post dot title, and yeah, with Django-mockingbird, this is where the specs argument comes in, where you can, specs is an argument that's just a dictionary where you can specify fields like we want this blog post to have title DragonPy because we need this for the test to pass. And that's how you do it in like my Django-mockingbird example. Now, if you're asking me how would I do it without Django-mockingbird, I don't know. That's why it sucks. There's always a way, but it's, yeah, not easy.
Cool.
Because there's this thing that with the Python's mock object, which again could be a talk in itself, and I'm sure it was at some point, it has this, for example, magic mock object, which is sometimes used for this use case, where it has a feature that as soon as you access a field, it creates it. So I could do blog post dot DragonPy and it wouldn't say anything. So that's when you get like false positives, and yeah, it's not, I think it's kind of an abuse of mocking, and yeah.
All right.
Oh, that's, yeah. That's a, I don't know if that's a cool question, but obviously I have 2 GitHub profiles, and obviously, yeah, I don't know if that's a smart or a stupid question, but thanks for that. Yeah, I have 2 GitHub profiles.
I think that's as Yuri was saying before this started, that maybe every GitHub thing is another reason to charge more. Is that the gist of things, if you remember?
Oh yeah, so I need to like prove that I've written it. I think I just have.
No, the opposite. It's you have now 2. That's it. You get a bonus. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll ask Yure how to ask for a bonus. We know that he's the best for that. Yeah, no, I have a couple of alter egos, and Yeah, I mean, obviously, since it's my first library, I wanted to, the reason I did a separate GitHub profile for this, if you really want to know, is because I was afraid what would happen if it would be like a giant fail or whatever. So
Well, I gave it a star. I did read the code a bit in the MakeMocks. So
yeah, I'm
people, you
glad.
can go star it and then this is
Yeah,
cool.
everybody go start the profile, the repo.
And read the code because it's good. It's interesting. This meta stuff. You know.
Yeah, it is kind of, there is a little bit of meta programming logic in it. And it was nice because it's something that you usually don't get to do on a job, on your day job. And it's like exciting if I'm gonna make it work or not. And the Django Meta API does, obviously, this couldn't have happened without it. But it doesn't, it has some features, but not maybe, you know, it could have more.
Alan, in
not-
your experience, is the Django Meta API well documented, or did you have to dig through the code a lot?
No, I actually didn't. I didn't do that much digging in the code because that's what I was just trying to say. It's not the Django Meta API. It was essential for this library, and I'm sure there's other libraries that use it as well. But it's not that extensive. It has like a few features and that's it. So that's why the documentation does do a good job with covering it. And there's even, I think it is used, like it's not an open secret. People do use it because there's also Stack Overflow questions on that. And
Is it a public or a private API?
no, it's public, but it's, yeah.
Django docs are listing it like any
Yeah,
other.
it is listed in the docs. I think it was, there is a story behind it. I'm not sure about it right now. I think it was private at first or something like that. And also it has been changed a couple of times. So if there was an issue, that was actually the issue, that you have to, the API to get fields from a model has changed like 5-7 years ago. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, that it is it. But the interesting thing about, the exciting thing about writing this library is the fact that not everything could be done with the Django Meta API. There was like a lot of things that had to be implemented in another way. And that's where some simple meta programming comes in, as I'm sure you'll see in the source code.